the galaxy had never seen such an unusual alliance. Princess Zyra of the ZyraHFY Empire was a proud and powerful leader. Her people were fierce warriors, their technology far advanced compared to the human species. But the princess, with her beauty, wisdom, and grace, was not just a ruler. She was a symbol of everything the ZyraHFY Empire stood for. Her royal lineage was one of strength and authority, and her every decision shaped the future of her people. Yet, she had made a choice that shocked many in her empire. She had chosen a human, Nate Reeves, as her husband. To many, it seemed like a strange decision. Humans, after all, were seen as weaker beings, lacking the powers and technologies that the ZyraHFYans had. They were primitive by the standards of galactic species, bound to their home planet with limited resources. Yet there was something about Nate that had caught Zyra's attention when she visited Earth on a diplomatic mission. He was calm, intelligent, and remarkably kind. His ability to think quickly and act without hesitation intrigued her. He was not like the other humans she had encountered, who were often self-centered or overly ambitious. Nate was different. At first, Zyra had dismissed her growing feelings as mere curiosity, but over time, she realized she could not ignore the connection they shared. Unlike many of the other potential suitors from powerful species, Nate did not try to impress her with grand gestures or forceful declarations of power. Instead, he listened to her, respected her, and most importantly, he made her laugh. His quiet strength was a stark contrast to the noise and ambition of the other suitors vying for her attention. When Zyra returned to ZyraHFY space, she made the bold decision to marry Nate. Her advisors were furious, and many of the ZyraHFY elite looked upon the union with disdain. How could the princess, a symbol of strength and power, choose to marry a human? Some whispered that she had made a grave mistake. Others worried that it would weaken the empire. But Zyra was determined to follow her heart, and she believed that the union would be a step toward peace between the two species. Humans and ZyraHFYans had long been at odds, their relationship filled with suspicion and conflict. Perhaps this marriage could change that. Nate, on the other hand, was overwhelmed. He never thought his life would take such a turn. One moment he was an ordinary man living on Earth, and the next, he was a husband to a powerful alien princess. The ZyraHFY palace was nothing like the world he had known. The architecture was vast and imposing, filled with strange symbols and intricate designs. The people were taller, stronger, and more advanced in every way. But despite the difference in their worlds, he was determined to make it work. He had always been a man of logic and reason, and he believed that if he stayed true to himself, he could find a way to fit into this new world. He spent his days learning about ZyraHFY culture, studying their history, and attempting to understand their complex social systems. He wanted to be more than just the husband of a princess. He wanted to be a part of her world. And so he worked tirelessly to adapt, hoping that one day he would earn the respect of the people who viewed him as nothing more than a curiosity. But Zyra never doubted him. She saw something in Nate that others did not. She believed that he had a unique perspective, one that could help bring about change. She often found herself talking to him for hours, seeking his counsel on matters of diplomacy, culture, and even personal issues. His insight, though simple at times, often struck her as deeply profound. He had a way of looking at the world that no one else did. As time passed, their bond deepened. They became partners in every sense of the word, supporting one another through the challenges they faced. While Zyra dealt with the weight of ruling an empire, Nate provided a grounding presence, reminding her of the importance of love and compassion in a world often consumed by power struggles. It wasn't long before their marriage became a symbol of hope. The people of the ZyraHFY Empire began to see that their princess had chosen her own path. The fact that she had married a human didn't make her weak. It showed that she was willing to break down the walls of division that separated their worlds. Slowly, the whispers of doubt turned into murmurs of support.
If the princess could find common ground with a human, perhaps the two species could find common ground as well.
However, as the weeks turned into months, Not everyone was pleased with this new alliance. There were factions within the Empire that saw Zyra's marriage as a betrayal. Some believed that the ZyraHFY people were losing their strength, their heritage, and their superiority.
These individuals grew restless, their discontent simmering under the surface.
They saw Nate as a threat, not just because of his human origins, but because he represented a shift in the Empire's values.
One such faction was led by General Valrek, a ruthless and ambitious military leader. Valrek had long harbored aspirations to rule the Empire, believing that the ZyraHFYians should remain at the top of the galaxy, with no alliances with lesser species. He had never agreed with Zyra's marriage to a human, and he saw it as a sign of weakness. Valrek began to rally support among the military elite, promising them power and prestige in a new order where ZyraHFYians would no longer share the galaxy with other species. His words resonated with those who feared that their empire was crumbling under the weight of peace. They believed that by uniting the empire under one banner, under Valrek, they could restore their place as the dominant force in the galaxy. But the princess and Nate had no idea of the storm brewing in the shadows. One evening, as the two of them sat in their private quarters enjoying a quiet dinner, the peace was shattered by a sudden explosion. The palace was under attack. Nate leapt to his feet, instinctively moving to protect Zyra. He had never been in a battle before, but he had seen enough action in his time on Earth to know what was at stake. As sirens blared and the palace guards scrambled to respond, Zyra remained calm. She had been trained for moments like this.
Stay behind me,
Zyra ordered, her voice steady as she moved toward the door.
We will handle this.
But Nate hesitated. He could see the fear in her eyes, the weight of the responsibility she carried as the leader of her people. And in that moment, he made a decision. He would not hide behind her. He would fight beside her, even if he was just a human in the midst of a galactic war. Zyra turned to him, surprised by the determination in his gaze. "You are not trained for this, Nate," she said.
I may not be trained like you, but I've learned how to survive, Nate replied. And I'm not leaving your side. With that, the two of them stepped into the fray.
The palace was under siege, and the ZyraHFYian forces were quickly being overwhelmed by the enemy. But Nate was not like the other soldiers. His mind raced, thinking through every possible strategy. He saw openings, weaknesses in the enemy's plan that no one else noticed. As chaos erupted around them, Nate moved with precision, guiding Zyra through the battlefield, using the environment to their advantage. At first, the ZyraHFYian soldiers underestimated him, thinking he was nothing more than a liability. But as the battle raged on, they began to see that Nate was no ordinary human. He was resourceful, quick-thinking, and most importantly, he was fearless. Every move he made, every decision he took, saved lives. And as the battle continued, Zyra watched in awe. This man, whom she had once thought of as harmless, was proving to be far more than that. His courage, his intelligence, and his ability to think on his feet made him a true warrior in his own right. She realized then that she had misjudged him. Nate was not just a husband, he was a force to be reckoned with. In the midst of the chaos, they made their way to the heart of the palace, where the enemy had breached the inner sanctum. With Nate's guidance and Zyra's strength, they fought side by side, pushing back the invaders. But they knew that this battle was just the beginning. There were more challenges to come, and the enemies of the throne were not done yet. The storm was only starting. And with it, the princess would learn just how dangerous her human husband truly was. The battle was far from over. As the dust settled in the palace, Nate and Zyra stood side by side, surrounded by the remnants of the chaos. The enemy had retreated, but the price of victory had been steep. The once glorious palace, with its towering spires and elegant design, now stood scarred by explosions and the violence of war. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, mixing with the sound of distant alarms and the echo of soldiers rushing to secure the remaining grounds. Zyra had never seen her people in such disarray. For the first time in her life, She felt the weight of responsibility press down on her in a way she had never imagined. The attack on the palace was not just an assault on her home. It was an attack on everything she had worked for. Her marriage to Nate, her efforts to bring peace between the ZyraHFYians and humans, all of it was now under threat. Nate stood beside her, his face grim, but his expression was resolute. He had never imagined himself in the middle of a battle like this, but the events had unfolded so quickly that there was no time to process what was happening. When the palace had been attacked, his first instinct had been to protect Zyra, but in the chaos of the fight, he had become something else. A fighter. He had seen the destruction unfold before him, and he had done what he had learned to do. Adapt. He had used every skill he had, every tactic he knew, to help save the palace and the people inside it. Now, as the last of the enemy forces were driven back, he turned to Zyra, his voice low.
We need to find out who is behind this. Zyra nodded, her mind already racing. This was no random attack.
It was planned, coordinated. They knew exactly when to strike. We need to be ready. This won't be the last time they come for us. Zyra's eyes narrowed, her resolve hardening. She had always known that her position as the leader of the ZyraHFYian Empire would make her a target. But she had never imagined that her enemies would go so far as to attack her own home. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the future of her people. She couldn't afford to let fear control her actions, but she couldn't deny the truth that was beginning to settle deep within her heart. As much as she had tried to protect Nate from the dangers of the Empire, it was clear that he was no longer the naive human she had once believed him to be. He had fought with a skill and a determination that rivaled the best of her warriors. His quick thinking had saved countless lives, and in that moment, she realized that she had misjudged him. Zyra turned to him, her expression softening. You were incredible out there, Nate. Nate looked at her, his expression unsure. I was just doing what needed to be done. You did more than that, Zyra said, her voice firm. You saved us. Nate didn't respond. He didn't feel like a hero. He had just done what he had always done. Survive. But there was something about Zyra's praise that made him feel as if, for once, he wasn't just a bystander in his own life. He had been part of something bigger. Together, they made their way through the palace, speaking with the remaining soldiers and assessing the damage. Nate, though he was still an outsider in many ways, felt a strange sense of pride as he helped organize the efforts to restore order. The ZyraHFYian soldiers had initially been skeptical of his abilities, but now they were beginning to look at him differently. He wasn't just the human prince. He was a member of the team, someone who had proven his worth in the heat of battle. As Zyra led the charge to rebuild, Nate's mind wandered. Who could have orchestrated such an attack? The rebels, the ones who opposed her rule, had always been a nuisance, but they had never been capable of such an organized assault. No, this was something bigger. The attack had been too precise, too well planned. Someone had known exactly how to strike at her weakest moment. They met with their advisors in the royal war room, a place usually reserved for discussions of diplomacy and strategy. The room was dimly lit, the air heavy with the tension that had been building for hours. Zyra sat at the head of the table, her posture straight and commanding. Nate stood beside her, his arms crossed, listening intently to the reports coming in from the front lines.
The attackers have retreated, Your Highness. General Norin reported.
He was a tall, imposing figure, his face scarred from years of battle, but they left behind nothing but destruction. It's clear that they meant to destabilize the Empire. Zyra's brow furrowed as she considered the information. This was no simple rebellion. Whoever did this had access to military-grade weapons and knew the layout of the palace. This was an inside job. Nate's mind raced as he processed the information. What if they're planning something bigger? This attack could be just the beginning.
Zyra looked at him, her eyes sharp. I agree.
Whoever is behind this won't stop until they've overthrown me.
But we can't act without knowing who they are. We need more information.
Norin nodded. We have spies in every corner of the Empire, but none have reported anything that could indicate a new threat. This came out of nowhere.
Zyra's voice was calm but unwavering. Then we will have to find them ourselves. Nate didn't like the sound of that. He knew that Zyra was right. There was no time to waste. But he also knew how dangerous it was to go after the people responsible without knowing exactly who they were or what they wanted. The enemy had shown their hand, but the deck was still stacked against them.
I'll do whatever I can to help,
Nate said, his voice steady. But we need to stay one step ahead of them. Zyra turned to him, her eyes softening. I've underestimated you, Nate. I see that now. Nate shook his head. I'm just trying to help. We're in this together. Zyra smiled, a small, genuine smile that made Nate's heart skip a beat. It wasn't often that she showed such warmth, but in that moment it felt like she truly saw him for who he was. Not just her husband, but her equal.
As the meeting continued, Nate's thoughts drifted back to the battle.
He had never imagined that his life would be turned upside down like this. He had come to the Zarathian Empire expecting a life of luxury, but instead, he had found himself in the middle of a war. Yet, despite the danger, despite the uncertainty, there was something inside him that refused to back down. He had found a purpose. He had found a reason to fight. But as the hours passed, the weight of the situation settled in. If they didn't act quickly, everything they had fought for would be lost. Nate could sense the urgency in Zyra's voice, in the way her eyes darted back and forth as she processed the reports. She was strong, but even she had her limits. In the days that followed, Nate and Zyra worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. They spoke with allies, gathered information, and carefully plotted their next move. But the more they uncovered, the more they realized how deep the conspiracy ran. It wasn't just the rebels who were after the throne, it was those within the Empire itself. There were traitors among them, people who had once been loyal to Zyra, but had now turned against her, seeking power for themselves. One night as they sat together in the quiet of the royal quarters, Nate turned to Zyra. We can't do this alone. We need more allies. Zyra sighed, her shoulders heavy with the burden of her responsibilities. I know. But who can we trust? Nate looked at her, his voice steady. We have to trust each other. You and me, we're all we've got. For the first time in a long while, Zyra allowed herself to relax, her walls coming down. She had always been the leader, the one who carried the weight of the Empire on her shoulders. But in that moment, she realized that Nate was more than just a husband. He was her partner, and together they would face whatever came next. The storm was far from over, but Zyra and Nate had weathered the first of its fury, and in the days to come they would fight side by side, as equals, ready to confront the darkness that threatened everything they held dear. The days following the attack on the palace were tense. Zyra and Nate knew that the real battle was just beginning. The palace, though temporarily secured, was not safe. The attack had revealed how vulnerable they were. The enemy had shown that they could strike when least expected, and the palace's defenses had been too easily breached. The rebels were not the only threat they faced. There were traitors within the Empire, men and women Zyra had trusted, who had turned their backs on her for power. Nate could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The first time he had stepped foot on Zarathian soil, he had thought he was entering a world of luxury and peace. Now, he was part of a conflict that seemed much bigger than he had ever imagined. He had come to ZyraHFY to build a life with Zyra, but instead, he had found himself in the middle of a war. But there was no turning back. Zyra had made it clear that she would not give up her throne. She would fight for the Empire, for the people who still believed in her, and Nate would stand by her, no matter what. As the days passed, the palace began to return to some sense of normalcy. The soldiers, who had been scattered in all directions during the attack, regrouped. Supplies were restocked and the injured were treated. Zyra spent most of her time with her generals, planning their next moves. Nate, though not a soldier, had been involved in every discussion, his ideas and strategies valued more than ever. It was clear that his training on Earth, his understanding of human tactics and survival, had made him an asset in this new world of galactic warfare. But even as they prepared for the inevitable counterattack, a sense of unease lingered in the air. It wasn't just the knowledge that the enemy was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. It was something deeper, something that Nate couldn't quite put into words. The palace was filled with whispers. There were rumors of betrayals of allies who were turning against them. Nate had always been an outsider in the world of politics and power, but he could sense the tension in the air. It wasn't just the threat of external enemies that worried him. It was the growing distrust within the palace walls. One evening, as Zyra and Nate sat together in the private quarters of the royal palace, the door opened quietly, and General Norin entered. His face was tense, his eyes dark with worry. "Your Highness," Norin began, his voice low, "there has been a development, a new threat, one we did not anticipate." Zyra raised an eyebrow. "Go on!" Norin glanced at Nate before continuing. "We've received reports of a group of dissidents within the Empire. They call themselves the Zerathian Resistance. They claim to fight for the people, but in truth they seek to destabilize the throne and take control for themselves." Nate's heart sank. The news didn't surprise him, but it made the situation even more dangerous. Traitors, rebels, and now an organized resistance movement. It seemed as though the Empire was unraveling from within.
Do we know who they are?
Zyra asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Norin nodded. "We have intelligence on some of their leaders. They have support from factions within the military, as well as from influential figures in the court. But we haven't been able to trace the full extent of their operation yet." Zyra stood, her posture tall and commanding. "We need to act quickly. If they are truly as powerful as they seem, we cannot afford to wait. Nate, I need your help on this."
Ooh. "You have the perspective we need." Nate was taken aback by her words. He had expected her to ask her generals, to rely on her advisors, but she was looking at him, waiting for him to speak. "I'll help," Nate said, his voice firm. "We can't let this empire fall apart. I'll do whatever it takes." Zyra nodded, her eyes meeting his with an intensity he had never seen before. "I know you will." They spent the next few hours in deep conversation, going over the reports and analyzing every detail. It was clear that the resistance was well organized, and they were willing to go to great lengths to achieve their goals. Nate's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to outmaneuver them. The resistance was different from the rebels. They were more calculated, more dangerous. They had the resources and the influence to make a real push for control. And if they succeeded, it would mean the end of everything Zyra had worked for. As the evening wore on, Zyra and Nate decided that they needed to act quickly. They couldn't wait for the resistance to make the first move. Instead, they would take the fight to them. They would hunt down the leaders of the resistance before they had a chance to build up their power any further. But the task was not an easy one. The resistance had spies everywhere, and they were skilled at hiding in the shadows. It would take all of Nate's cunning and Zyra's strength to find them. They couldn't afford any mistakes. The next morning, they set their plan into motion. Zyra called for a meeting with her most trusted generals, and Nate was included in the strategy discussions. Though he was still an outsider in the world of military tactics, his insights were invaluable. He knew how to think on his feet, how to anticipate the enemy's moves. His understanding of human psychology and his ability to read people had already proven to be a great asset. He was beginning to see himself not just as Zyra's husband, but as a key player in the survival of the Empire. Days turned into weeks as Zyra, Nate, and their forces tracked down leads, uncovering more about the resistance with each passing day. They discovered that the group's influence stretched farther than they had first thought.
it was not just soldiers they had to worry about. It was politicians, influential citizens, and even some of Zyra's closest advisors. The resistance movement was not just a threat to the throne, it was a threat to everything Zyra had built. But as they closed in on their target, Zyra began to sense a deeper danger. The resistance had been using clever tactics to remain hidden, but they had also been manipulating public opinion. Rumors were spreading throughout the Empire, rumors that Zyra's reign was weak, that she had married a human, that the alliance with Earth had weakened the Empire's strength. These rumors had caused unrest among the people, and Zyra knew that if they were not careful, the resistance would be able to turn the public against her. Nate was not blind to the effects of the rumors. He could see the way some of the palace staff looked at him, the way some of the soldiers treated him. He had always known that his position was tenuous. But now, it seemed that every step he took was being scrutinized. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the Empire's expectations on his shoulders, but despite the growing tension, he remained determined. He had chosen to stand by Zyra, and he would continue to do so. He had seen the strength in her. She was a leader, not just by birth, but by conviction. She had earned her throne, and he would do everything in his power to help her keep it. One night, as they sat together in the royal quarters, Zyra turned to Nate, her expression softening. "I never wanted any of this," she said quietly. "I never wanted to be at war. I thought that if I could just bring peace, if I could just prove that the Zerathians and humans could coexist, maybe everything would be different. But now I see how naive I was." Nate took her hand in his voice gentle. "You're not naive. You're trying to make a difference. You've always been strong. And you've always believed in peace, even when it seemed impossible. That's why I'm here." "I believe in you." Zyra smiled, her eyes searching his. "You're not like the others, Nate. You see the world differently. You've taught me to think outside the boundaries of our empire, to think beyond the walls we've built around ourselves. Maybe that's what we need right now." Nate nodded, a sense of determination building within him. Together they could face whatever came next. The resistance may have been clever, but they were not invincible. With each passing day, Zyra and Nate became more united in their mission. The threat to the throne was real, but their bond, stronger than any weapon, was the one thing that could not be broken. And as they continued to fight side by side, Nate knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The days leading up to the final confrontation were filled with tension. Nate and Zyra had worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of the Resistance's influence. They had tracked down several of the group's key leaders, exposing their plans to destabilize the throne. But with each victory, new challenges arose. The Resistance had become more desperate, their attacks more coordinated, and the people of the Empire began to turn against Zyra. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers about her marriage to a human, about her supposed weakness, and about how she was unfit to rule. Nate had always known that being with Zyra would bring challenges, but the depth of the political turmoil in the Empire was beyond anything he had imagined. His role as her husband had always been a point of contention, but now it was being used against them both. The Resistance, in its effort to weaken Zyra's power, began to manipulate public opinion, turning the people against her. One evening, as they sat in their war room, reviewing the latest reports from their spies, Zyra's eyes were heavy with the weight of it all. The palace, once filled with hope and ambition, now felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on her as she tried to make sense of the chaos.
"We've exposed the leaders of the Resistance, but they're still out there," Zyra said quietly, her voice betraying the exhaustion she felt.
We've eliminated some of their key figures, but they've gone into hiding. We still don't know the full extent of their reach.
Nate stood by the table, his gaze focused on the map of the Empire spread out before them. His mind was racing, thinking through their options. He had seen enough of Zyra's leadership to know that she wasn't ready to give up, even if it seemed like everything around her was falling apart.
She was more than just his wife. She was the leader of the ZyraHFY Empire, and he would do whatever it took to help her keep it.
We need to take the fight to them, Nate said, his voice calm but determined.
We can't keep reacting to their moves. We need to make the first strike.
Zyra looked up at him, her eyes tired but sharp. And how do you propose we do that? We've already been tracking their movements, and they're elusive.
We can't afford to make a mistake?
Nate nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation.
We need to use their own tactics against them. The resistance is hiding in the shadows, but they rely on public support.
If we can expose their true intentions, if we can show the people that they are not fighting for freedom, but for power, we can turn the tide in our favor. Zyra considered his words, her brow furrowed as she thought it through.
She had always relied on strength, on her ability to command her forces and fight in the open. But Nate's strategy was different. It was subtle, calculated, and it played on the one thing the resistance hadn't counted on: the truth. You're right, she said finally. We have to show the people who they really are.
If we can cut off their support, we can force them into the open.
We'll hit them where it hurts.
The plan was set into motion.
They began to carefully leak information to the media, using their influence to expose the true nature of the resistance. They uncovered documents, intercepted messages, and gathered testimony from defectors who had left the group. It became clear that the resistance was not the noble cause they claimed to be. They had been manipulating the people, using fear and propaganda to incite rebellion, all in the name of gaining power for themselves. But even as the public began to turn against the resistance, Zyra knew they were still not out of danger. The group had supporters in high places, people who were not afraid to fight dirty, and the longer they remained in hiding, the stronger their resolve would become. Nate and Zyra both knew that they had to strike soon, before the resistance could regroup and become even more dangerous. The final showdown came sooner than they expected.
Late one night, Zyra received word that the resistance had made their move.
A small but well-armed group had infiltrated the capital, targeting the heart of the Empire's power, the royal palace. They had learned from their previous mistakes, and this time, they were ready to take the throne by force. The resistance believed that if they could capture Zyra, they could use her as a puppet ruler, forcing her to sign over control of the Empire. Zyra wasted no time. She called her generals and rallied her forces. Nate, standing by her side, knew what was at stake. This was no longer just about politics. It was about survival. The resistance had made their mistake. They had underestimated Zyra, and now they would pay the price.
Ready your forces,
Zyra commanded.
We fight tonight. The palace was in chaos as the enemy forces breached the gates. Zyra and Nate led the charge, rallying the royal guards to their side.
The resistance had been quick to strike, but they were not prepared for the sheer force of Zyra's will. She moved with precision, her every command calculated and deliberate. The palace guards, once hesitant about Nate's involvement, now followed him with unwavering trust. They had seen him fight, and they had seen the courage he displayed. Nate fought beside Zyra, his mind sharp as he scanned the battlefield. The resistance's forces were numerous, but they lacked the discipline and unity of the royal army. As the clash between the two sides escalated, Nate's military instincts kicked in. He directed the guards, setting up defensive positions and creating traps to outmaneuver the enemy. It was like a game of chess, and Nate was the master strategist. But just as it seemed the tide was turning in their favor, a familiar face appeared in the midst of the battle. General Valrek, the leader of the resistance, emerged from the shadows. He had been the mastermind behind the attacks on the palace, and he was not about to give up without a fight.
Zyra, Valrek called out, his voice booming across the battlefield. You cannot win. Your empire is crumbling and you are weak. You should have never married that human. He has led you to your doom.
Zyra's eyes narrowed, her hand gripping her sword tighter. You underestimated me, Valrek.
And now,
You will pay for it. The two leaders faced each other in the middle of the chaos, their eyes locked in a fierce standoff.
Valrek raised his weapon, a deadly energy blade, and swung it at Zyra. She parried with ease, her movements fluid and precise. Nate watched from the sidelines, ready to intervene if needed. But he knew that this battle was one Zyra had to fight herself. For what felt like an eternity, the two warriors clashed. Valrek was a skilled fighter, but Zyra was faster, more agile. With each strike, she pushed him back, wearing him down. The battle was not just physical, it was a battle of wills. Zyra was fighting not just for her life, but for the future of her people, for the empire that she had dedicated her life to protecting. Valrek, on the other hand, was fighting for power, for his vision of a world where the Zarathians ruled supreme and humanity was kept in its place. But Zyra would not be swayed. With one final powerful strike, she disarmed Valrek and sent him crashing to the ground. He lay there, defeated, his dreams of conquest shattered. "This is over, Valrek," Zyra said, her voice cold as she looked down at him. "Your rebellion ends here." As the remaining resistance fighters were rounded up and captured, Zyra turned to Nate, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it!" Nate nodded, his heart still racing from the intensity of the battle. "Together," Zyra smiled, the weight of the Empire's future finally lifting from her shoulders. The palace, though scarred by the conflict, was theirs again. The resistance had been defeated, and Zyra's rule was secure. But even as they stood victorious, Zyra knew that the challenges they had faced were only the beginning. There would always be those who sought to tear down what she had built. But with Nate by her side, she knew that they could face whatever came next. Together, they were unstoppable.